The listing had one rule in bold red letters: never open the basement door after 10 p.m. I broke that rule on my second night in that house, and I have never been able to explain what I saw when I did. 3 weeks earlier, I was scrolling through late-night classifieds, desperate for extra cash between freelance jobs, when I found a house-sitting post on Craigslist. A remote property 2 hours outside the city, 6 weeks of work, with the first 2 weeks' pay wide up front and the rest paid in cash once the contract was complete. The pay was almost triple what any normal house-sitting job offered, and that alone should have made me suspicious. The homeowner, a soft-spoken older man named Arthur, met me only once in a parking lot to hand over the keys. He didn't invite me inside to look around first. He just gave me a folded piece of paper with the house rules typed out, told me to read it carefully, and said he'd only be reachable by email while he traveled. Most of the rules were ordinary: water the garden, collect the mail, don't let strangers inside. But rule number 4 was different from anything I'd ever seen on a house-sitting listing. Do not open the basement door after 10 p.m. for any reason, no matter what you hear. I laughed about it on the drive out. I told myself it was probably about a broken step or old wiring, something boring dressed up to sound mysterious. The house itself was beautiful in a lonely kind of way. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, surrounded by pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the road. The first week was quiet. I watered the garden, fed a stray cat that came around the porch, and worked on my laptop during the day. At night I mostly stayed upstairs, because the house had a strange habit of creaking in ways that didn't quite match its layout. Sounds that seemed to come from directly beneath my feet, no matter which room I stood in. On my second night, a storm rolled in around 9. Thunder rattled the windows, and the power flickered twice, before finally giving out completely just before 10. I lit a few candles Arthur had left in a kitchen drawer, and told myself I would simply go to bed early. That's when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, coming from somewhere below the kitchen floor. Not from a door, from underneath, like something pressing up against the wood from below. I froze completely still, candle in hand, listening. The knocks came again. 3, slow, deliberate, and then, faint but unmistakable, I heard something that sounded almost like breathing, rising up through the floorboards, along with the smell of wet stone. I checked the clock on my phone. 9:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the rule technically applied. I told myself that was ridiculous, that a rule written on a piece of paper couldn't possibly matter to whatever was on the other side of a locked door. But some deep animal part of me refused to move toward that basement door before exactly 10 o'clock. I stood in that kitchen for 2 full minutes, watching the seconds crawl by on my phone's lock screen, listening to 3 knocks repeat over and over from beneath the floor. At exactly 10 p.m., the knocking stopped, all at once, like someone had simply let go of the wood. The following morning, I emailed Arthur, describing exactly what I'd heard, half expecting him to fire me on the spot for how shaken I sounded. His reply came within minutes, as if he had been waiting for it. He told me the house used to belong to his brother Daniel, who had renovated the basement himself over 20 years earlier, digging it deeper than the original foundation to build a workshop. Daniel disappeared without a trace during that renovation. The official investigation went nowhere. Arthur inherited the house years later and sealed off the basement, only ever entering during daylight, and only for a few minutes at a time. He said the knocking always started sometime after 9 and always stopped exactly at 10, and that in 15 years of living there, he had never once opened that door after dark. On the 3rd day, I found a small collection of photographs tucked inside a kitchen drawer, curling at the edges. Most showed a younger version of Arthur, standing beside a taller man with the same sharp jawline, unmistakably his brother. In every photo, Daniel stood slightly apart from the camera, his eyes fixed somewhere just past the lens, as if watching something the photographer couldn't see. The stray cat that visited the porch never once came inside the house, no matter how much food I left near the door. It would eat quickly, glance toward the kitchen window, and disappear back into the tree line before dark fell completely. Some nights, I noticed it sitting perfectly still at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house long after I'd gone to bed. Near the end of my first week, curiosity got the better of me during daylight hours, and I found an upstairs room at the end of the hall that Arthur hadn't mentioned in his instructions. Inside, everything looked frozen in another decade. A narrow bed still made, a dresser with rusted tools laid out in neat rows, and a calendar on the wall permanently open to a month 22 years gone, one date circled twice in red ink. I wanted to leave immediately, but the first 2 weeks' pay was already wired, non-refundable, and I genuinely couldn't afford to walk away from the rest of the contract. So I stayed, and I made myself a rule of my own: lock the basement door before 9 every night, and never, under any circumstances, go near it after dark. During my second week, unable to let it go, I searched the property's address late one afternoon. I found a single archived newspaper clipping from 22 years earlier, a missing persons notice for Daniel, age 34, last seen at his own workshop. The article mentioned that investigators found the workshop's back wall freshly plastered over, and that his hand tools were found neatly stacked, untouched, as if he'd simply stepped away mid-task. Buried in an old local forum, I found 3 separate posts, years apart, from people who claimed they'd house-sat a property off Route 9 and quit within their first 2 weeks, always vague about why, always ending their post with some version of the same sentence: "Don't stay past 9. In a second email a few days later, almost as an afterthought, Arthur added one more instruction: if the knocking ever changed to only 2 knocks instead of 3, I was to leave the house immediately, day or night, and not return until he could meet me in person. He didn't explain what 2 knocks meant. I didn't ask. For the next few weeks, my rule held. The knocking continued most nights, right on schedule. 3 slow knocks, starting sometime after 9 and stopping exactly at 10. I got used to it the way you get used to any bad noise you can't fix. Not comfortable with it, but no longer paralyzed by it either. On the 9th night, halfway through my stay, I woke suddenly at 9:47 p.m. to a silence so complete it felt wrong. When the knocking finally started a few minutes later, I lay perfectly still, counting under my breath. 1, 2, and then nothing. No third knock came. I sat upright in the dark, heart pounding, waiting almost a full minute before, finally, faint and almost reluctant, a third knock arrived, late and out of rhythm. I didn't sleep again until sunrise. On the 17th night, my phone rang at exactly 9:52 p.m., an unknown local number. I answered out of nervous reflex. There was no voice on the other end, only the same 3 knocks I'd been hearing through the floor for weeks, perfectly timed, coming through the phone speaker instead of the floorboards. The call lasted exactly 8 seconds and ended precisely at 9:53. After that night, I stopped answering unknown calls entirely, and I counted down the remaining days on a paper calendar taped inside a kitchen cabinet, crossing off each one the moment I woke up. On the 23rd night, I dreamed I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, watching my own hand reach for the deadbolt in the dark. In the dream, the knocking didn't stop at 10. It kept going, faster and faster, until it stopped being 3 knocks at all, and became something closer to fists pounding against wood from the inside of a box too small to move in. I woke up at 3:14 a.m., completely certain someone had been standing beside my bed only a second before I opened my eyes. On my final night, with my bag already packed by the door, I told myself I had earned one small act of curiosity before I left for good. I wanted to see the workshop Arthur had mentioned, just for a few seconds, using my phone's flashlight, well before the 10 o'clock cutoff. It was 9:40 p.m. I unlocked the deadbolt and walked down the stairs. The workshop was smaller than I expected, lined with old tools rusted onto pegboards, a workbench coated in decades of dust. Against the far wall, half covered by a stained canvas tarp, stood a tall wooden cabinet, roughly the size and shape of a standing coffin. I don't fully know why I pulled the tarp aside. Curiosity, or the strange compulsion that dares you to do the one thing you know you shouldn't. The cabinet had a heavy iron latch, and someone, at some point, had scratched 3 deep lines into the wood at exactly the height where a person's knuckles would land if they were knocking from the inside. My phone buzzed in my pocket, 9:58 p.m., and from directly above me, at the top of the basement stairs, I heard the front door of the house creak open, followed by slow, heavy footsteps crossing the kitchen floor directly over my head. I hadn't invited anyone. I was completely alone in that house, and something was now walking across the floor above me, while I stood in a basement I had been told never to enter after 10. I don't remember climbing those stairs, only the empty kitchen, every window locked from inside, no sign anyone had been there at all. My phone read exactly 10 p.m. when I finally stopped running in the driveway, staring back at a dark house that looked, for one impossible second, like it was breathing. I left without my final week's pay, and some nights I still think about those 3 scratch marks, cut at exactly knuckle height, and about who or what has been counting down to 10 o'clock every night for over 20 years.